I reflected a lot on the overall concept note that you and Ken put together, which I thought was inspiring and for me. And you'll see from my note, what I essentially wanted to do was a couple of things. I wanted to think and raise awareness about what matters to me about this topic. So I talked about how social relationships matter, how context matters, and how an analysis of both is important before we move forward into defining changes to governance. I was taken a lot by Tor's comments on time. I'm still grappling with fully understanding the temporal natures, but I do know that time allows me to think more about direction, about movement, about continuity and change, and about choice, because choice only takes place within time. And I think that the definition of governance that you presented somehow left choice out, and maybe we should reflect on that over time. But in my sort of 15 minutes or so, if this works, yeah. I originally was going to do 5 things. This is not going to take very long. I wanted to establish that we are in new and distinctively unsettled times, that the context in which we're discussing is special and requires us to reflect on special relationships and things. I do talk about reimagining governance, and I make no apology for relating a lot of my thinking on this to the issue of leadership, and we've talked about that before. Governance isn't leadership, they're different, but they're very closely related. My overall topic is about times of disconnection, because essentially I do find that the relations that we seek are difficult to find in the form that we need them. So we are not in a relational age, though we should be. We're in an age of disconnection. And my solutions and answers to some of Sherto's questions earlier, I respond to this by saying, what would it look like? What would this new form of governance look like? And they're what I call my 8 destinations, which I unfold a little more in the discussion note, but I'll refer to those. And then rising from yesterday, I thought I would change my presentation slightly to allow me to talk a little bit about research that I'm currently right in the middle of. So it's very, very nascent. When I've been interviewing public leaders, global leaders, about why they became leaders, and not expecting them to tell me exactly the reasons that are truthful and everything else, but actually alongside other qualitative tests and other analysis of documentation, I wanted to try and confirm that the governance we talk about is actually a very diverse thing. And we need to understand a little bit more, I think, about why leadership within governance emerges, for what reasons. And I was going to then refer finally to my worry about trust and social capital, but if we have time, I will do. So we know, and I don't have to say it again, but it is important to stress that better governance brings results, brings better times. It's a critical factor for human flourishing. And that's why it matters. That's why it's so critical to get right. But my overall theme is one that you've all picked up already. I'm just piggybacking that the 21st year of the 21st century is a particularly anxious time. And unfolding that, my wobbly blancmanges, why is it anxious, I think is really quite critical. There are many things that could be on our list, but the 5 things on my list inform the sort of lens that I want to look forward in terms of new forms. I think we do live in an age now of unyielding and accelerating pace of change, not change itself, but the speed at which it takes place. I'm influenced by Harmut Rosa's work on social acceleration. I think we do live in an age of unprecedented pressures that are resulting from changes in power relations. I think we live in an age where we've always had technological change, but now we have technology disrupting as well as solving some of the issues that we have in unprecedented scales and contexts. And my 2 final sort of thinking about why it's particularly different now than before, I think we're in an age now where global power has been disconnected from responsibility in a way that we haven't seen before to the same degree. And an age, secondly, or finally, where the key debate is between accountability and impunity. These are very distinctive blancmanges that wobble in our time and that do demand us to think more about the forms of governance that we might expect. So this is a time with new and very distinctive interconnections. It's not an end of history. We referred a little bit to Fukuyama yesterday, but I think there are three parts of the coming out of that context where we want it to go that really do matter. I think we do want a place and a time when people are at the heart of a collaborative world. I think we do look for a time when multilateral frameworks work for everyone and are effective. And I think we are continuing to struggle in ways that will help preserve democratic participation. I think all those matter hugely, and they should influence the way in which we look at future through the lenses for the future. So all that leads me to look in the work that I'm doing currently on reimagining what sort of leadership is likely to bring more conducive to some of those challenges, more conducive in terms of resolving them. There's all sorts of labels, all sorts of adjectives we can use, but the current ones I'm using are deliberative leadership and adaptive leadership. Adaptive, really drawing on the work of Ronnie Heifetz at Harvard. I think deliberative leadership, a leadership style that can help where no easy solutions exist, will become a critical skill. And I'll unfold a little bit of this in my 8 destinations. I think adaptive leadership does context by taking risks, by experimenting, by exploring options. They cultivate a diversity of viewpoints to generate a large number of options. They don't drill down too quickly. And they lead with empathy, and they value positive contributions by employees and stakeholders with autonomy and more independence. And I think adaptive leaders are looking for no harm strategies that bring win-win solutions rather than winning at the expense of some. So my list of 8 things, which I elaborate more in, I don't elaborate more, but I write them down in my discussion note, really about what I call my destinations. If we were to look in this very short space of time, that's all we can do, at what might emerge as an appropriate, more fit for purpose form of governance for this particular age. These are the sorts of things that I would expect to see. And I think because you can define some of the destinations, you can set the trajectory of thinking and of building. I think that the future forms of governance must be prepared to ask the right questions and be humbled of that they might not know what they are. And what does that mean for the way they set about forming the questions before they ask? The relationship between decision makers and experts will be critical in the future in this context. I think future governance must be able to work in complex adaptive systems. Complexity matters, and the science and literature on complexity should feature in our thinking and our working through that. I think we are often caught in linear and reductionist processes and notions, and we need to think very differently about the wicked problems that you solve one part and they create new ones that you didn't maybe anticipate. I think that the future forms of governance must cultivate trust. I think trust will become the glue when we're uncertain, when we're unfriendly, when we're in disagreement. We can still cope in a complex adaptive system if we've nurtured more trust between the players. I think future governance forms will have to be more agile and more adaptable to the profundity of change to which I've only fleetingly referred. And I think we will need to use our agility to be humble and to make mistakes and learn from them. I think that the future governance cannot just deal with part of the systems. It has to look at the whole. And I think leadership struggles in its definition, certainly leaders do. When we define leadership by what leaders do, we ought to be defining leadership by what leaders are failing to do, as well as what they haven't even thought about doing. Governing the whole will be critical in a complex, adaptive future, I think. I think also that leadership and governance must be able to manage the loss that results from change, not just the success that follows change. Change brings with it a fundamental tension because it brings loss, and we must be able to manage that loss better than we do. That's something about compassion, something about empathy, but it's also about the awareness of loss as well as the awareness of gains. And I think Jyoto's mentioned at an earlier time, we must mainstream the relationship between the very local, the very, very here and now with the more global. Global and local leadership are not mutually exclusive, and they must be dealt with. And interdependence calls for alternative governance and leadership approaches. And finally, my eighth sort of destination quality is that we have to invest in continuing learning. There's nothing new about that. It's not a big surprise. But the intensification and disruptiveness of change, both social change, technological change, requires an agility, a humility, and a phenomenon of leadership which is built around continuous learning. I said I'd pause for a little in my sort of discussion to look at the research I'm currently doing on why leaders. This is a wonderful photo. You'll remember it, I'm sure, from a selfie taken by a set of leaders. The best part of the picture is, however, is the Mrs. Obama sitting there with some concern. But in my research, I've spoken at the moment, we're just over 50 different world leaders. I'm very fortunate to have had access and to have gained access to these. And I've explored how they can explain why they've emerged as they have in leadership positions within governance structures. And obviously, we came into this with an assumption that one size doesn't fit all. And this is what I've become to call now the uncommon ground of governances, plural. So there are 5 that have merged as sort of leading reasons that not all leaders are honest about, but doing a number of research methodologies, you can begin to define. Some people are leaders because they just want to be leaders. They like the positionality. They don't have an agenda. They just have an agenda which is focused on themselves. There are those who are deeply unhappy about the current position that they see in the world, and they want to tear it all down because they have a pretty clear idea about what they want to replace it with. There's a third group who want to tear it all down without necessarily having any ideas about what they want to introduce in its stead, with the assumption that if you destroy what's there, whatever will emerge will be better than we have at the present time. And then there are those who don't particularly want to destroy everything, but they do want change. And they do have a clear view about the way that they want to change and the outcome of the change, more evolutionary. And finally, there are those who I think we need to nurture and encourage more. These are those who are unhappy with the way things are, and they want to change it, but they're focused on the way in which that change takes place. And they have a view of how to change it is to help people engage with each other to develop new ways of running things, rather than having a very clear model of what they want to impose or insist upon. This, to me, is an idealized relational governance, of course. It's a process in which the process of change is as important an agenda item as the destination you're seeking to achieve. So these led me to a sort of an analytical tool, which is the way I work. It's trained as an economist, so I like everything in nuts and bolts ways. But it's quite interesting. You know, you have a perspective now on the horizontal here between a position where anything is better than what we have now, through to we have a clear agenda, a vision for the future. We've written our strategy. So there is a spectrum. If you look at a range of leadership examples around the world, you will find those that believe that anything's better than now, and others that have a passion and a vision and a clarity. And on the vertical, you have those leaders and governance structures that are intent on building constructively, as opposed to those who simply think the best way of building is actually to destroy. From the ashes will arise something else. And that leads you to the sort of quadrants that allowed me to explore in my conversations with leaders what these sort of positionalities on the spectrum leads. You've got the frying pan and fire position, where you drop everything and build something else, and not without really clearly thinking about it, through to the positions where you tear everything down and impose something new, only for someone else to come along and do the same again in the next cycle. The blue area, of course, is the concern about how to change. So the trick in terms of discussing and thinking about new forms of governance is how can we encourage a movement towards this top right-hand quadrant? How can we encourage a governance to emerge which shares a clear agenda and a vision for the future, with a passion for building this in a process-driven way that is inclusive and so forth? It may seem, and probably is, you'll tell me, very simplistic, but it's helped me to begin to analyze the experiences that we can draw on from governance that currently exists, what lessons we can learn. Final comment, I have a couple of minutes, is simply also to look at the notion of trust and trusted relationships, both what we need and what we expect from governance. I've made the point, and others have better than I, that trust will be a critical factor within relationships that enable governance processes that reflect and value relationships to work better. And I've spent a lot of my academic career looking at social capital, both the richness of analysis that enables, but also its inadequacies. And most of social capital restricts itself, as my discussion note suggests, to a relationship between individuals, to the networks, the bridging and the bonding between individuals and sets of individuals and small communities. My horizontal axis here between contexts and relationships where there is very little trust, and there's a lot of out-group behavior in social psychology literature, through to the end of the spectrum where there's high levels of trust, where in-group behavior is commonplace. I think that social capital tradition and that literature ignores the important characteristics in relationships between people and small communities with big, powerful, strong structures and institutions, which is my vertical axis in this case, where you have a spectrum between people who are valued and engaged in the structures and people who are excluded and marginalized. And similarly, we can see the types of governance that I described in my last analysis with the types of trust scenarios that this briefly captures, does show again that we need to be reflecting on what is the obstacle course that we must encounter, we must defeat, what we must overcome, in order again to nurture us into the top right-hand quadrant on this particular analysis. Now, this is very much work in progress. I don't pretend it to be finished, but I did think it was relevant to share, and I'd be really interested, of course, in all your criticism for this particular symposium. This is a very important area that we don't need to always start our discussions with clear pictures of where we're going to end up. So in my sort of approach, I've got sort of 8 things that I hope we'll discover at the end of our journey, our 8 destinations. And I also need to understand better why those who participate in an influential way within the governance structures that emerge, why they're there anyway, and what is the nature of trust in this particular case upon which they draw. So thank you.